in my two chapters, and they're back to back, it's the origins of codependency, and followed by the origins of pathological narcissism. I paint a very, very dark, sad, and horribly bleak picture of the child, the child who's to become a narcissist. They are victims of a form of trauma that far exceeds that which the person to become codependent will. And so, but the reason I bring that up is at the core of their disorder is repressed, unconscious shame, self-hate, feelings of rage against the world. And it is so deep and so large and so self-destructive, it has to be compartmentalized and locked away. And that's why pathological narcissists, for the most part, in my experience, have a hard time remembering their childhood. But the reason I bring that up, and it has to do with something you said, is that they are so much more wounded, and the primary catalyst for their behavior is shame. Deep and profound shame and self-hatred. They might not be able to recognize it and feel it. And so what I'm hearing you say is that you're able to not only get your narcissistic clients to recognize it, to understand its impact on their thinking, their emotions, or behavior, but to kind of bring it out and potentially resolve it. Is that a fair explanation for what I believe you do?
When I can do that, again, it's having enough leverage to be able to begin immediately from the minute they sit down, paying attention to signs and cues of narcissistic modes, these sides of them showing up in the relationship with me. And from stories I've already heard and something that's been brought to my attention, maybe from a loved one. And then, beginning to look for the origins of that. I agree with you. There's a severe form that is very fragile at the core because of trauma. But there's also, what we know from the literature and narcissism from my own years of working with them is many of them also don't remember their childhood because it was subtle. It was subtle, but it has a deep impact. So the subtlety might be a very doting parent or spoiling parent, or a parent who just puts them up on a pedestal. They're not actually gouged in the trauma that others might be there, and yet they can still be as difficult and as aggressive because they've never learned how to tolerate frustration. They've never learned how to be uncomfortable. Exactly. And so they face a world with a partner who suddenly has very reasonable expectations, and it feels like a burden because they're used to always being the hero without doing anything. Or that, they whatever they do to prove themselves, it comes easily to them. But in the world of emotions and intimacy, they don't have a clue. So the background may not be as harsh in all cases, which makes it really hard because you're not going back to a parent who was abusing them and beating them, but it was a parent who was really, in many ways, just neglecting the need for balance and discipline and limits and teaching the child how to prepare to live in the world with frustration.
But we're actually on the same page because you can be a victim of profound emotional incest, a victim of profound neglect, profound deprivation, and that is the attachment trauma that is responsible for the pathological narcissism or somewhere on the continuum. Maybe it's the adjective that I'm using is a little bit on the dramatic side, and yes, I'm guilty of that. but we're really talking about the same thing. Profound trauma that is soul gouging can be subtle, that there is not a memory of, being, beaten up by an abusive alcoholic father or sexually abused. It could be amorphous and invisible. And even if you did remember, you might not be able to put it together. So thank you for making that distinction.
Yeah, I just think, again, we have to think in terms of not one size fits all. There are different categories along this spectrum that help us to appreciate, and again, not necessarily the severity of how they turn out, because you can have a spoiled child who was not abused, but was maybe, I guess abused by overindulgence, but not abused by neglect or deprivation. And they can turn out to be quite severe in their narcissistic profile. So, it's not always so easy to see that this leads to this or this leads to that. We have to look at it very carefully and understand, and also take into account the things that are hard to know, like temperament and, biology. And, I often say, I don't know how you measure this. I don't know that you can, but I often think that narcissists are probably born ultra sensitive babies. They're very sensitive. While all babies and little ones need that kind of love and attunement, attention that creates security in the world, I think narcissists are probably more sensitive, and they come into an environment where there's less available. But all of the popular literature says, who could treat a narcissist? They're untreatable. Right. And I say, you're not wrong. They're really hard to treat. And most of them don't get better. But some do. And I think more could, with more people feeling comfortable, working with them. But it's still, the jury is still out. It's hard. And it's hard when you're up against a lot of literature that just says, run as fast as you can. Satan is chasing you,
My focus is understand why you're attracted to people that hurt you.
Yeah.
Better. And if they want to get better with you, stay with them. But if not, run. Everything that you say, Wendy, makes me want to say that your Schema Therapy could work for SLDs. I need to learn more about it. But we only have so much time we can talk about. And I just want to thank you so very much for